The night my parents treated my children like they were an inconvenience, I realized something inside me had finally snapped. Christmas dinner was supposed to mean warmth, celebration, family. At least that's what I used to tell Lily and Mason when they asked why we still went to the Monroe mansion every year. But sitting there on the edge of that velvet sofa, watching my sister Charlotte list every luxury dish she wanted while my kids sat quietly beside me like shadows, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not hurt, not disappointment. A spark. A dangerous one. My father didn't even hesitate when he looked right at me and said, "Your children can eat whatever leftovers are in the kitchen. They're not guests." My mother nodded as if it were reasonable. Charlotte laughed, and everyone else simply moved on. The chandelier flickered overhead, the smell of roasted lamb and butter drifted through the air, and yet all I felt was this sharp, cold clarity. I looked at my kids. Lily's tiny hands folded in her lap, Mason gripping the hem of my coat, and something twisted in me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was the exact moment I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. And I swear none of them saw it coming. The December air slapped against our faces as we walked up the long stone path toward the mansion earlier that evening, my old Honda crunching over the gravel behind us. Twinkling lights wrapped around the oak trees, white ribbons draped along the balcony, and wreaths big enough to frame a doorway hung on every window. It was the kind of display meant to impress the neighbors, not welcome a family. Lily held a little gift bag she'd decorated herself with blue construction paper and glitter that still clung to her coat sleeves. Mason stayed close to my side, his small hand gripping mine as tightly as he could. I carried a modest pie dish apple cinnamon, the only thing I could afford to bring this year after paying bills and winter boots. Before I could knock, the door opened and Maribel, the longtime housekeeper, appeared with a soft, tired smile. "Be careful tonight," she whispered under her breath as she took the pie from my hands. "It's tense." I didn't have time to ask what she meant before she hurried off toward the kitchen with Lily and Mason's coats draped over her arm. The voices hit us as soon as we stepped inside. My father's deep, authoritative tone, my mother's polished laugh, and Charlotte's bright chatter, something about holiday shopping in New York, how exhausting it was choosing gifts for everyone she cared about. The mansion looked the same as always, the grand staircase wrapped in garland, the marble floors shining under the chandelier, the massive Christmas tree sparkling in the corner. But something about it felt colder than usual. Maybe it was because every year I hoped it would feel like home again, and every year it didn't. Charlotte didn't even stand up from the velvet sofa when she saw us. "Oh, good you made it," she said, swirling her wine. "Traffic was it? Or that old car again?" She didn't wait for an answer. "We're here now," I replied softly, guiding the kids inside. My father folded his newspaper with unnecessary drama and checked his watch. "Punctuality is a virtue, Claire. You should try honoring it." I swallowed the familiar sting. We had a slow start. Charlotte smirked. "Maybe ask for a better car next time. Or a better job." She laughed at her own joke, and my mother didn't correct her. I steadied myself, placing a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. He stiffened, already shrinking from the noise and judgment around him. Lily's eyes drifted toward the tree, but she didn't dare move closer without permission. As we all gathered in the living room, my father pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the same one he used to track investments as if Christmas dinner needed a strategic plan. "Let's finalize tomorrow's menu." He turned to Charlotte first. "What would you like, sweetheart?" Charlotte grinned like she was awarding him the privilege of asking. "Prime rib, lobster tails, truffle mac and cheese, and that chocolate soufflé with the raspberry glaze." Excellent choices, he praised, writing everything down as if she were a distinguished guest. "And my cranberry brie bites," my mother added proudly. Nobody looked at my children. Nobody asked what they might enjoy. Nobody even acknowledged the gift bag in Lily's hands. When my father closed his notebook and declared the menu perfect, the silence that followed pressed against me like a weight. Lily shifted beside me, her lips parting just enough as if she wanted to mention her favorite pumpkin pie. But before she could speak, my mother waved a manicured hand. Your children can eat whatever leftovers are in the kitchen. They're not guests. For a moment, the room blurred. The tree light smeared into streaks of gold, Charlotte's laughter echoed in my ears, and the fireplace crackled too loudly. My kids froze. Lily's eyes wide with confusion, Mason's hand clamping onto mine like he might disappear if he let go. I felt something inside me move, not the familiar ache. Something sharper. Charlotte took a sip of wine and added, "You should be grateful they even get a seat at the table." My father didn't even look at me when he ordered, "Go set the table." "Claire, that's what you're good at." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply held my children's hands a little tighter. Lily's voice trembled as she whispered, "Mom, did we do something wrong?" I forced a smile, though inside something was beginning to burn. "No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong." And as Charlotte laughed in the background and my parents resumed their conversation about place settings and guest lists, that spark inside me grew hotter. They had no idea what they had just started. I was 10 years old the first time I realized I was never going to be treated the way Charlotte was, and that memory came rushing back to me as I sat there in my parents' living room with the weight of their words slicing through the air. While Charlotte laughed, and my parents praised her every comment, I drifted into the familiar ache of childhood, the ache that never really went away. My 10th birthday had been a quiet one. A grocery store vanilla sheet cake with too much icing, a couple of candles, and a few rushed photos my mother snapped before taking a phone call. Charlotte leaned forward and blew out half my candles before I could inhale. She clapped and announced she was helping, and everyone laughed. Except me. The day had felt small even then. Forgettable. But when Charlotte's birthday came each spring, the entire house transformed. Caterers filled the kitchen, a string quartet played in the foyer, and family friends filled the yard. Flowers wrapped the staircase. My parents walked around shining with pride as if she were royalty. I remember standing at the top of the stairs once watching Charlotte twirl in her sequined dress, wondering why there was never room for me to be special too. High school didn't change anything. If anything, it deepened the divide. When I won the state spelling bee, my father clapped politely and said, "Of course you did well, Claire. You're practical. You don't have distractions." He meant it as a compliment, I think, but it felt like another wall between us. Charlotte's dance recital later that month earned her a dozen roses and a catered dinner. My certificate was tucked into a drawer. I used to tell myself it didn't matter that love wasn't about parties or praise. But the truth was, every small moment added up until I felt like I was fading into the wallpaper of my own family. And now, watching Lily and Mason sit silently beside me in that same living room, the wallpaper feeling crept back in a way I hadn't felt in years. Lily shifted closer, clutching the little handmade gift bag. "Mom," she whispered, "do you think Grandma liked my drawing?" I swallowed hard. My mother hadn't said anything. I'd watched her take Lily's drawing earlier, hold it between two fingers like it might stain her blouse, then pass it to Maribel with a quiet, "Put this somewhere." Somewhere usually meant the trash. I brushed a strand of Lily's hair behind her ear and whispered, "Your drawing was beautiful. She saw it, sweetheart." Mason sat rigidly beside me, his small shoulder pressing into mine for reassurance. He was always more sensitive than he let on, and he heard everything. Every comment, every sigh, every dismissal. Charlotte didn't stop talking. She floated through stories about spending last summer in Santorini, about the villa she stayed in, about her plans to travel to Florence in the spring. Her voice rose above the clinking utensils on the table, above the crackling fire, above the quiet breaths of my children. My mother leaned in, hanging on to every word. "Yes, darling," she cooed. "Travel is what enriches a person. Culture makes you refined." Lily sat still, her eyes falling to her lap. She loves to draw Paris and Florence. She dreams in color in places she's never seen, except in books I borrow from the library. And yet she said nothing. She'd already learned that speaking too loudly in this house invited ridicule. Mason poked at his napkin, swallowing hard when Charlotte said, "Some children just need better guidance." My heart clenched. I could feel the cracks forming inside me, the same cracks I'd patched 1,000 times since I was a girl. The dining room was a museum of wealth, crystal goblets, polished silver, a chandelier that sparkled like stars. But that night it felt like a spotlight exposing every flaw my family believed I had. My father looked at Charlotte like she was the center of his world, nodding at each of her stories. My mother's smile stretched wide, her pearls gleaming. And then there was me, practical Claire, the daughter they didn't need to impress. The one they expected to be available, quiet and grateful. When Grace reached for a water glass, my mother's sharp voice cut through the room. "Careful, don't make a mess." She didn't say it with malice. She said it the way she said everything, like a truth she didn't think needed softening. Mason looked up at me with wide eyes, as though checking if he'd done something wrong just by breathing. I gave them both a small, steady smile. Inside, I felt something shifting again, something long buried. A voice that once whispered but now pressed louder. "Enough." The piano in the next room played a slow carol. The tree lights flickered, and my family continued their conversation as if my children didn't exist, as if I barely did. Charlotte laughed again, a bright, rehearsed sound that echoed through the crystal ornaments. My mother poured her more wine. My father scribbled something in his notebook, nodding along. Then Mason tugged my sleeve gently. "Mom," he whispered, "can we go home soon?" I looked down at him, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, his eyes too sad for a child his age. And in that moment, I didn't see just my son. I saw myself at 8, 10, 12, waiting for a sign that I mattered, waiting for someone to say my voice was worth hearing. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling both kids closer. "We will soon," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew something far bigger was coming. I wasn't just going home. I was walking away from something I had let define me for far too long. The dining room shimmered under the chandelier's golden glow. But to me, it felt more like a spotlight exposing every crack in the Monroe family. The polished mahogany table stretched elegantly from one end of the room to the other, set with crystal goblets and silver cutlery, every detail arranged as if for royalty. Yet all I could think about was how small Lily and Mason looked at the far end of the table, their backs straight, their hands folded, trying their best to be invisible. Charlotte leaned comfortably in her chair near our parents, her wine glass held delicately between her fingers. She was talking loudly enough for the whole world to hear about her summer in Santorini, describing the villa perched over the cliffs, the unforgettable sunsets, and the private chef who prepared her meals each night. My mother leaned forward, eyes glowing with admiration. My father nodded as though every word she said carried significance. Meanwhile, Mason tried to cut a piece of lamb, his hands shaking slightly. The fork scraped against the china, and my mother's sharp gaze snapped toward him like a whip. "Richard," she murmured, "did you hear that children really must learn proper manners?" Heat flushed across my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "They're doing fine, Mom. They're only children." Charlotte smirked. "Maybe they just need more exposure to refinement. When we were little, I never fidgeted at the table." My father chuckled. "You carried yourself like a young lady from the beginning. Some things can't be taught." Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at her lap as if afraid that lifting her eyes might draw attention. I could almost hear her thoughts, wanting to mention the Paris drawings she made, wanting to talk about the watercolor set she hoped Santa would bring. But she stayed silent. She always stayed silent here. Charlotte continued completely unaware or uncaring of the effect her words had. "I've been thinking of spending a few weeks in Florence this spring. Maybe Paris, too. It's important to expose ourselves to culture." My mother sighed dreamily. "Yes, that's why you're so polished, darling." Lily's shoulders dropped. She didn't say a word, but I saw it. The sting, the shrinking, the quiet realization that her dreams didn't matter here. I felt the shift in my chest, subtle at first, then sharper. It was the same feeling I'd had earlier, the one that told me tonight wouldn't end the way they expected. My father reached for his notebook again, scribbling something between bites. "The prime rib came out well," he said to Charlotte. "You were right to choose that." Not one glance toward my kids. Not one acknowledgement that they were hungry or anxious or even present. Mom Mason whispered under his breath, barely loud enough for me to hear, "Can I have more bread?" Before I could answer, my mother lifted a hand. "Maribel can get it later. We're in the middle of something." Mason sat back, his cheeks turning pink. He blinked fast, trying not to cry. I wanted to reach across the table and pull him into my arms, but instead I placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "They're only children," I said again, more firmly this time. Charlotte didn't miss the tone. She raised her glass, slightly smiling. "Claire, you always get so emotional. Relax, we're just talking." Talking, that's what she called it. This endless stream of comparisons, belittling comments, and subtle digs that shaped every holiday, every gathering, every memory. Talking. The chandelier glistened above us, reflecting off crystal ornaments on the massive Christmas tree in the corner. The tree was perfect, symmetrical, tall, meticulously decorated. I used to love this room. I used to think the glow from the lights felt magical. But now I only felt suffocated. Lily reached for her water glass with trembling fingers. Her eyes flicked toward me for permission, as if she needed reassurance that she wouldn't be scolded. I nodded gently, and her shoulders relaxed just a little. As the meal went on, the chatter from my parents and Charlotte formed a constant hum, drowning out any possibility of my children having a voice. Every laugh felt louder than the last, every comment more dismissive, and every second that passed, the spark inside me grew hotter. The sound of Charlotte's laughter hit a pitch that made Lily flinch. Mason pressed closer to me, his small shoulder leaning into mine. Their reactions weren't loud, but they were enough. I knew that feeling. I'd lived that feeling. I lifted my gaze and looked straight at my father. He didn't see me. He never really had. He was too busy nodding along to Charlotte's every word, too busy indulging the daughter who gave him the image he wanted the world to see. My mother reached across the table to adjust a centerpiece. "Everything is perfect," she said. "Perfect. Perfect for them. A nightmare for me. A lesson in invisibility for my children." I felt the first real breath I'd taken all evening push into my lungs, and with it came a strange calm. Not peace. Something heavier. Something final. Lily leaned closer. "Mom," she whispered, "are we going home soon?" Her voice cracked something inside me open. I looked at my daughter, at my son, at their small, hopeful faces, and I knew. We weren't staying here another minute. I sat up straighter, my hand sliding onto Lily's and Mason's, grounding myself. "We will be," I whispered. "Very soon." And for the first time all night, I felt in control. The December cold hit me like a slap the second I stepped out of the Monroe mansion. It didn't matter that the porch was lined with glowing lanterns, or that the driveway sparkled with professionally placed lights. Nothing about that place felt warm anymore. Lily clung to my left hand, Mason to my right, their little breaths steaming into the dark as we hurried down the long stone steps. My heart was still pounding from the dinner table, from the look on my parents' faces when I stood up, from the uncertain tremble in my children's voices. But beneath the fear was something sharper, something steady. I had finally reached my limit. "Mom," Mason whispered, tugging on my hand, "are they mad at us?" I squeezed his fingers gently. "No, sweetheart. We're just leaving. That's all." But it wasn't just leaving. It felt like walking out of a life I'd been trapped in for decades. The cold wind rustled through the oak trees overhead as we made our way down the long driveway. My old Honda sat parked between two luxury SUVs, so out of place it looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Lily shivered, and I pulled her closer, wishing I could shelter her from everything cold or cruel. Behind us, the front door creaked open again. I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't turn. Heels clicked against the stone path faster and faster. Claire Charlotte's voice. I stopped but didn't face her until she was almost beside us, breath puffing into the night. "You can't just run off like that," she said, though her tone had lost its earlier bite. "Mom and Dad are furious." I pulled the kids behind me. "I'm not interested in their fury tonight." Charlotte looked at the mansion, then back at me. Her eyes flicked to the children, and for a brief second her expression softened. Not with pity, something closer to uncertainty. Maybe regret. "They invited you tonight because they needed something," she said quietly. My pulse stuttered. Needed what? Charlotte hesitated, her painted lips parting like she wanted to say more, but she just shook her head. "You'll see." Then she turned and walked back toward the glowing house, shoulders tight, posture stiff. I watched her disappear behind the tall white columns. Whatever her warning meant, it only made the night feel colder. I unlocked the car and helped Mason into his seat while Lily climbed in carefully. When I slid behind the wheel, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with something fierce and heavy. For years I had tried to be patient, tried to keep peace, tried to survive the quiet humiliation that always followed me in that house. But tonight, the weight snapped. I started the engine and steered us down the winding drive. Christmas lights blurred across the windshield as we passed house after house, each one glowing like a polished postcard. But none of the beauty touched me. I could still hear my father's voice, condescending sharp, telling my children they weren't guests. I could still see my mother's dismissive smile, Charlotte's mocking smirk. I swallowed hard, focusing on the road. "We're going somewhere better." "Okay," I said softly. Lily leaned forward in her seat. "Where, Mommy?" I didn't know until I pulled up to a warmly lit restaurant on the corner of Harbor Drive. Morton's was far fancier than anywhere I usually dared take the kids, the kind of place where people on dates clinked champagne glasses. But tonight, I didn't care. I unbuckled my seatbelt. "Here," I said. "Tonight, we eat somewhere people treat us kindly." Lily's eyes went wide. "Really?" Mason whispered. "Mom, this looks expensive." "It's Christmas Eve," I said, finding a smile. "We deserve something good." Inside, the warmth hit us instantly. A hostess actually smiled when she saw the kids. "3?" she asked gently. "3." I replied, and she led us to a booth with soft lighting and holiday garlands wrapped around the windows. When the server handed Lily and Mason menus and asked about their favorite flavors, they lit up. Just lit up. Lily whispered, "Mom, they asked what I wanted." "Of course they did," I said, brushing her hair behind her ear. 20 minutes later, watching them dig into salmon and mashed potatoes with real laughter in their eyes, I felt my chest loosen for the first time all night. Mason told me a silly joke he heard at school. Lily asked if we could make our own ornaments tomorrow. Their voices rose and fell like they were safe because they finally were. Halfway through dessert, my phone buzzed against the table. Then again. Then again. My screen filled with missed calls. Mom, Dad, Charlotte. Unknown number, voicemail, voicemail. I turned the phone face down. "Aren't you going to answer?" Lily asked softly. "Not tonight," I said. "Not tonight. Not after what happened. Not after watching my children shrink under the weight of my parents' cruelty. Not after finally finding the spark I'd buried years ago." When we got home, I tucked the kids into bed. Lily hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you for leaving." I kissed her forehead. "Thank you for being brave." Then I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. The calls kept coming, each vibration a reminder of the life I'd just walked out on. My finger hovered over my contacts list. I scrolled past familiar names until one stopped me cold. A name I hadn't seen in years. R. Barlow. The number Aunt Rosemary had pressed into my hand when I was a teenager, telling me if it ever becomes too much, call this person. I stared at the name until my heartbeat steadied. Not tonight, but soon, very soon. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my phone had already buzzed itself halfway across the kitchen table. I stared at it while the coffee brewed the knots in my stomach tightening each time the screen lit up with another missed call. 17 from my mother, 14 from my father, 6 from Charlotte, and a scattered handful from numbers I didn't recognize. It felt like every thread I'd pulled last night had begun unraveling faster than I could process. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I poured my coffee and sat quietly in the dim kitchen, letting the warmth ground me before I hit the voicemail icon. The first message was my mother's voice, high and clipped. "Claire, this is ridiculous. Come back before your father says something he regrets. Delete." The next was my father, his tone sharp. "Pick up the phone, immediately. We need to talk about your behavior. Delete." Another from Charlotte, a hushed whisper, panic threading through her voice. "Claire, please call me back. They need something from you." It's bad. My finger hovered for a second, then I deleted that one too. But the next voicemail wasn't from family. A professional voice, crisp and unfamiliar. "Ms. Monroe, this is First Atlantic Trust. We need to confirm your identity regarding a signature on file. Please return our call. This is time sensitive." I froze. Identity signature. My heart thudded so loudly I heard nothing else for a moment. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to contacts until I found the name I'd stopped on last night. R. Barlow. The name Aunt Rosemary had given me when I was 16. My hand trembled slightly as I pressed call. The line clicked twice. Rebecca Barlow speaking. "Hi," I breathed. My name is Claire Monroe. Rosemary gave me your number a long time ago." There was a pause. Then her voice softened in a way that startled me. "Claire, I've been hoping you'd call someday." My heart lurched. You knew I might." "I did," she said gently. Rosemary made very sure of it. "Now tell me what happened." So I did. I told her about the dinner, the humiliation, the phone calls, the voicemail from the trust company, about the years of feeling dismissed, invisible, used, about last night being the moment I finally couldn't take it anymore. She listened quietly, giving small, affirming sounds, never interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Claire, do you have any idea how much your aunt worried this day would come?" "Which day?" My voice cracked. "The day your parents crossed a legal line involving you." My breath stopped. "What legal line?" Rebecca's tone shifted, no longer warm, but precise. "Professional. Your aunt suspected years ago that your parents were using your name on documents without your knowledge. She asked me to keep an eye on it. In recent weeks, irregular filings connected to their trust have resurfaced." I felt the kitchen tilt slightly. "Are you saying they forged my signature?" "Yes," Rebecca said. "And from what I'm seeing today, they didn't just forge it once." My fingers tightened around the phone until they hurt. Rebecca continued, "Claire, your parents mortgaged their home. They placed their real estate business under an unstable trust structure. Payments are overdue. Their accounts are at risk of being frozen. And that voicemail you received, that was the bank beginning its inquiry." I pressed a hand to my forehead. I didn't know any of this." "You weren't supposed to know," she said gently. "They were counting on that." A cold wave shot through me. Rebecca paused, then softened again. "Rosemary asked me to be your contact if things ever spiraled. She suspected your parents would lean on you financially someday, or worse, use you without your consent." "Claire, the situation has escalated. I can legally intervene, but only if you want me to." My breath quickened. "Intervene how I can file a formal notice challenging the authenticity of the documents that bear your name," she explained. "If I do, their assets will be frozen. A lien will be placed on the property. Their company will come under immediate review." I closed my eyes. My parents' voices from last night echoed in my mind, commanding dismissive cruel. Your kids can eat leftovers. You should be grateful they get a seat at the table. Go set the table, Claire. Do something useful. I thought of Lily's trembling hands, Mason's flushed cheeks, their small, hopeful voices asking if they'd done something wrong. Rebecca's voice broke through. I won't do anything without your permission. My chest tightened. For 30 years, every decision in that house had been made for me. Now, for the first time, someone was waiting for my answer. Claire, Rebecca said quietly, What do you want me to do? I took a long, shaky breath. I want you to act, I whispered. Do it. There was no hesitation on her end. I'll submit the filings within the hour. And Claire, you're doing the right thing. When I hung up, I sat still for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of the city waking outside. My hands were steady now. My heart beat too. I heard footsteps, Lily rubbing her eyes, wandering into the kitchen. Mom, she whispered. Are we okay? I pulled her into my arms and kissed her forehead. We're better than okay, I murmured. We're safe. But when my phone lit up again this time with a new voicemail from an unknown number, I knew the storm was only just beginning. The apartment felt too quiet when I woke up the next morning, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes your heartbeat sound too loud. I slipped out of bed carefully so I wouldn't wake the kids, padded into the kitchen, and nearly jumped when my phone lit up with a new burst of notifications. Missed calls, voicemails, texts stacked on top of each other like a rising tide. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, trying to breathe through the heaviness that settled in my chest. Then I tapped to unlock it. 32 missed calls, 17 new voicemails, and dozens of texts, some from my parents, some from Charlotte, and several from unknown numbers. The news alert at the top stopped me cold. Monroe Coastal Properties faces emergency federal review. My breath stalled. I clicked it open. A video loaded automatically, my father leaving his office while reporters shouted questions about financial discrepancies and trust irregularities. The camera angle shook as microphones shoved in his face. Someone yelled, "Is it true the property trust is in default?" My father didn't answer. He just pushed past the crowd, jaw-clenched eyes wild. My mother appeared a moment later, shielding her face with her coat, telling cameras they were misinformed. She looked small, smaller than I'd ever seen her. My phone vibrated violently again, and I hit play on the newest voicemail. It was Charlotte, her voice shaking. Claire, pick up. It's worse than we thought. They're saying you triggered the review. You need to talk to them, please. I deleted it. The next voicemail was a monotone male voice. This is the First Atlantic Trust Legal Department. Please return our call. We need to verify your identity regarding several signatures connected to Monroe Coastal Properties. My stomach twisted so hard I had to grip the counter. Footsteps padded into the kitchen, and Mason appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. Mommy, why are you up so early? I forced a smile. Just making breakfast. He climbed into his chair, and I slid a bowl of cereal toward him. Lily followed a moment later, her hair tousled, her voice sleepy. Mom. Someone was pounding on the door earlier. I thought it was thunder. I froze. The knock. The one I slept through. I checked the peephole instinctively, though I knew no one was there now. A chill crawled up my spine. I wasn't just dealing with angry parents anymore. I was dealing with panic, desperation, and people who were watching their world collapse. I set breakfast on the table, kissed both kids on the head, and stepped into the hallway with my phone. My fingers hovered over Rebecca's name before I pressed call. She answered on the first ring. Claire. They're losing everything, I whispered. The news I know. Her tone was calm, controlled. Federal review opened at 8 this morning. Their accounts are frozen. The trust is under immediate investigation. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This happened so fast. That's what happens when a signature is flagged as fraudulent. I pressed a hand against the wall. What do I do now? You do nothing, she said firmly. Claire, listen to me. This is not your responsibility to fix. A loud knock exploded through the apartment. I flinched so hard my phone nearly slipped. Claire Rebecca asked, "Is someone there?" "Yes," I whispered. The knock came again, harder. I edged toward the door, looked through the peephole, and my heart slammed against my ribs. My parents, both of them. My father's face was red, twisted with anger. My mother looked pale and frantic, her eyes darting up and down the hallway. "Claire," my father shouted, "open this door right now." I muted the phone and cracked the door open only a few inches. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "We need to talk," he snapped, pushing against the door. "Let us in." I stepped back but kept my hand on the lock. "The kids are here. Keep your voices down." They pushed their way inside anyway, stomping past me like they still owned every space I occupied. My father paced the living room, running a hand through his hair. My mother's gaze swept the apartment with thinly veiled disgust, like she wanted to wrinkle her nose at the worn carpet, but didn't have the strength to fake politeness. "You did this," my father spat. "You called someone. You made this happen." "I protected myself," I said quietly. "You forged my signature." His jaw clenched. "It was a placeholder. You were supposed to sign eventually." My hands curled into fists. "You put me and my children at risk." My mother pressed her fingers to her temples. "Claire, we were under pressure. You don't understand how much we've been dealing with." "No," I cut in. "You don't get to say that. Not after last night. Not after everything." My father slammed a hand onto the counter. "You need to fix this. Call off whatever you started." I stared at him, shocked at how calm I felt. "No." His head jerked up. "What did you say?" I said no, I repeated. "I'm done bailing you out. I'm done being your safety net." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Claire, we're going to lose the house." I swallowed. "Then you face the consequences of what you did." Silence crushed the room. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then Lily peeked into the living room, her small voice trembling. "Mom, are they here to yell at us again?" My mother choked on a sob. My father looked like someone had punched him. I placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. "No one yells at you here," I said, staring right at them. Something broke in their faces, something old and brittle. "You need to leave," I said softly. "Now." My father's face hardened, but he didn't argue. My mother hesitated, tears streaking down her cheeks, then followed him to the door. He paused before stepping into the hallway. "You think you're strong now," he muttered. "But this isn't over." I closed the door slowly, calmly, and locked it. Then I leaned my forehead against the wood, breathing in the stillness of my own home. For the first time, their threats didn't shake me. They didn't have power here anymore. I didn't expect Charlotte to show up the next day, but by late afternoon I heard timid knocking, nothing like the pounding from earlier. When I checked the peephole, she stood there with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, wearing no makeup, her perfect curls now a frizzy mess. She looked like she hadn't slept. I opened the door just enough for her to slip inside. She stepped in slowly, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. "You look—" I started, then stopped. There was no gentle way to say it. "Destroyed," she offered with a hollow laugh. "Yeah, that's about right." She walked into the living room and sank onto the couch. She didn't lounge elegantly like she always did. She folded into herself. That alone told me how bad things were. The kids were in their room playing, so I sat across from her. "What happened?" Charlotte exhaled shakily. "Everything. It's all falling apart." I waited. For once, she didn't make me drag the truth out of her. "Bradley's filing for full custody," she whispered. "He said I'm financially reckless, irresponsible, unstable. And now the investigation is public and reporters were outside the house this morning." Her voice cracked. "He said I can't even take the boys this week. Not unless there's supervision." My breath caught. I knew she cared about her kids. I'd seen glimpses of it even beneath the vanity and entitlement. This This cut her deeply. "Charlotte." "I'm sorry," I said quietly. She didn't look at me. "You don't have to pretend to care." "I'm not pretending." Her shoulders shook once, but she didn't cry. Charlotte never cried unless someone was watching. She wiped under her eyes quickly. "It's not just Bradley," she continued. "Mom and Dad, they're frantic. They spent all morning calling everyone they know, investors, lawyers, bankers. No one will touch them right now. Every call ends the same way, someone asking about the federal review." Her voice thinned. "Dad's convinced you did this to punish them. I didn't flinch. I did it to protect myself. And my kids." She nodded slowly, staring at nothing. "I know." Those 2 words stunned me. "You... No." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Claire, I heard them last night, after you left." My stomach clenched. "They were talking about you," she said. "About how they'd been using your name for the trust documents. How they needed you to sign things without asking questions. How they were sure you'd fold if they pushed you hard enough." She drew in a shaky breath. "And how humiliating your kids might make you more compliant." A cold fury rose inside me, but I kept my face still. Charlotte rubbed her temples. "I've always known they favored me. I'm not blind, but last night I realized it was more than favoritism. They see you as useful. Or they did." She looked up, finally, her eyes glassy. "Claire, you have no idea how twisted things have gotten. They're drowning in debt. The company is collapsing. And they're terrified of what comes next." "And you?" I asked. She let out a weak laugh. "I'm collateral damage." Silence filled the room, thick and pressing. Then Charlotte's voice softened. "I know I haven't been kind to you. I know I've mocked you, ignored you, made things harder. But Claire, I'm scared, and I don't know who else to come to." The vulnerability in her voice was something I'd never heard before. I took a slow breath. "Charlotte, what do you need?" "I don't know," she whispered. "Help, maybe. Or just someone to not hate me." The answer surprised me. For all her privilege, she sounded like a lonely child. "Sit," I said gently. "Let's talk." She let out a long breath, like she'd been waiting for that word. For the next hour, she told me everything. About Bradley's ultimatum. About her maxed-out accounts. About the condo Mom and Dad bought her being in their name, not hers, and at risk of seizure. About how she'd never learned to stand on her own because they always made sure she didn't have to. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see her as the golden child. I saw her as another daughter raised in a broken system. When she finished, she leaned back exhausted. "You must think I deserve all this." I shook my head. "No one deserves to lose their kids." Her chin trembled again. "I don't know how to be anything without them." This time she didn't wipe her eyes fast enough. A tear slipped down her cheek. I reached for a tissue and handed it to her. She stared at it like she wasn't sure what to do, maybe because no one in our family ever offered her comfort without an agenda. After a moment, she whispered, "Claire, I want to change. I don't want to be like them anymore." Her words were soft, fragile, but real. "You can change," I said. "But you have to start by being honest with yourself, with other people, with your kids." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I don't even know how." "We'll figure it out." Her eyes widened slightly. I gave a small smile. "You're my sister, despite everything." She stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time in decades, her expression wasn't proud or smug or polished. It was human. She wiped her eyes again. "Thank you, Claire." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. 2 little bodies creeping into the hallway. Mason peeked around the corner. "Mom, is Aunt Charlotte okay?" Charlotte froze. Lily stepped beside him, holding Mason's hand. She looks sad. I waited. Charlotte inhaled shakily, then knelt to their level. I was sad, she said softly. But you helped me feel a little better. Lily smiled shyly. Mason offered her a small toy dinosaur. Charlotte stared at it stunned. This is for me. He nodded. You can borrow it. The tiniest laugh escaped her quiet, cracked, but real. And right there in my small living room, I realized something important. Maybe the cycle didn't have to continue. Maybe the chain could break. Maybe this family could rebuild itself not around wealth or status or appearances, but around humility. And maybe, just maybe, Charlotte was the first crack in the wall. As she held the dinosaur gently in her palm, her voice trembled again. I don't deserve this kindness. But I saw something my parents never taught her to see. Then earn it, I said softly. One step at a time. 2 days later, the fallout spread like wildfire. It didn't matter where I went, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the school pickup line whispers followed me like shadows. People glanced at their phones, then at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity, pity, and something sharper. The local paper had printed a full-page spread about the investigation into Monroe coastal properties. My parents' faces were everywhere. Their empire, their pride, their reputation, all unraveling in public. I tried to keep my head high, but the weight of the attention pressed hard against my ribs. Lily and Mason held my hands tightly as we crossed the store parking lot. I kept my movements steady, calm. They didn't need to feel my panic. Inside the grocery store, the air felt thick. A woman from our old church stood by the apples staring at me for several long seconds before she pretended to inspect fruit she clearly wasn't buying. A couple at the deli counter leaned close, whispering loudly enough for me to hear the daughter. I clenched my jaw but said nothing. Let them talk. They knew nothing of what the last 30 years of my life had been like. When we got to the dairy aisle, I froze at the sight of someone sitting on my front steps. My heart lurched. It was Charlotte. She was still wearing the same coat she'd been in earlier. Her hair unbrushed, her posture slumped with defeat. Instead of makeup, salty streaks marked the sides of her face. She didn't even look up until I had parked the car. When she did, her voice cracked. Claire, you have to help me. I got out slowly. What happened now? She wiped her face. The press is outside the condo. They were waiting at the school this morning. Someone followed me in their car. I'm scared. Her voice splintered. And Bradley, he told his lawyer I'm a risk to the boys. He wants an emergency custody hearing. My breath tightened. Oh, Charlotte. She paced 2 steps, hugging herself. I know I made mistakes. I know I acted spoiled. I know I ignored your kids and I hurt you. But I never thought. Her voice crumbled. I never thought I would lose mine. That was the moment the wall between us cracked completely. Come inside, I said gently. She followed me, her steps wobbling, her hands shaking. I settled the kids in the living room with coloring books before sitting Charlotte at the kitchen table. Is there anything you haven't told me? I asked. Her eyes filled again. The condo isn't in my name. It's under the company. Everything I thought I had, it's all theirs. And when the company goes under, it goes too, I finished. She nodded, her chin trembling. I don't know how to fight this. I exhaled slowly. Then you don't have to fight alone. She looked at me stunned. After everything I've done to you, Charlotte, we were both raised in the same house. Just differently. I learned to disappear and you learned to shine at any cost. Neither of us got what we needed. Her breath hitched. I don't deserve your help. Maybe not, I said gently. But your children do. Her eyes closed as tears finally spilled over. When she could speak again, she whispered, I don't want to be like them anymore. I nodded. Then start here. Start small. Be honest. Be brave. For a moment, the kitchen felt still like the turning point it was. Then my phone lit up with an incoming call. Rebecca. I stepped outside to answer it. "Hi, Rebecca." "It's begun," she said calmly. "Federal notices were served this morning. Your parents' accounts are frozen. The house and business are now under audit." I leaned against the cold brick wall, inhaling the winter air. What happens next? There will be calls. Pressure. Probably a visit from them again. But Claire, you must not sign anything. And you must not negotiate alone. I swallowed. I won't. And one more thing, she added. Your parents are telling people you blindsided them. I laughed bitterly. Of course they are. You didn't, she said firmly. You protected yourself. And your children. Her reassurance clicked something into place inside me. Something steady, something unshakable. Thank you, Rebecca. My pleasure. Call me if anything escalates. When I stepped back inside, Charlotte was still at the table, staring at the dinosaur Mason had lent her earlier. She looked fragile, smaller than I'd ever seen her. Mason gave this to me, she murmured. He barely knows me. Why would he do that? Because kids don't care about pride, I said. They care about kindness. She blinked hard. You can rebuild, I said. It'll be hard. But you can. Charlotte's voice trembled. Will you help me? At least until I get through the custody mess. I hesitated not because I didn't want to help, but because helping her meant stepping deeper into the chaos of my family. But Charlotte wasn't my parents. She was salvageable. She was trying. Yes, I said. I'll help. Her breath shook out in relief. For a moment we just sat there, two sisters who had never really been sisters before. The kids ran in a minute later, laughing with crayons in hand. Mason tugged on Charlotte's sleeve. Do you want to color with us? Charlotte wiped her eyes and forced a shaky smile. I'd love to. And watching her sit cross-legged on the rug, coloring dinosaurs with my children, something softened inside me. Maybe this wasn't just fallout. Maybe it was rebirth. Maybe this was the moment our family broke completely so it could finally be rebuilt on the right foundation. Not wealth, not pride, but truth. And a chance at something better. The first knock came just after sunset. A hard, impatient pounding that made the picture frames on the wall rattle. I stiffened and glanced toward the hallway where Lily and Mason were brushing their teeth. Charlotte froze on the couch, clutching the throw blanket around her shoulders like armor. Claire, she whispered, that's them. I already knew. My stomach tightened as I approached the door. I looked through the peephole and saw my parents standing there, my father rigid and furious, my mother pale and trembling, her hair hastily pinned back instead of perfectly coiffed. I cracked the door open only an inch. The kids are getting ready for bed. Keep your voices down. My father pushed the door wider with his palm. We're coming in. They swept past me before I could answer. My mother's heels clicked sharply on the hardwood as she took in the living room the small tree Lily had decorated the toys neatly stacked in the corner. Something shifted in her eyes, but she blinked it away. My father wasted no time. Do you understand what you've done? I kept my distance. I protected myself. You destroyed us, he snapped. The auditors froze everything. Our accounts, the business, even the house staff walked out because payroll bounced today. That's not my fault, I said calmly. That's what happens when you commit fraud. My mother flinched. Claire, we were desperate. You don't know the pressure we've been under. We were going to fix it. You used my name, I said quietly. You forged my signature. You tried to trap me in your mess. My father's gaze sharpened. And now the entire town thinks we're criminals. I felt anger spark hot in my chest. I didn't commit the crime. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice trembling. Mom. Dad. You can't blame her for this. My father swung toward her. You stay out of this, Charlotte. She straightened, something unfamiliar, courage flickering in her eyes. She didn't do anything wrong. You used her. You planned to use her again. My mother sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Please, Claire, talk to whoever you called. Ask them to undo this. They'll listen to you. No, I said. My father's head jerked up as though I'd slapped him. What did you say? No, I repeated. I'm not fixing this. My mother's voice cracked as she stood again. We are your parents. And I'm your daughter, I said. But that never meant anything to you unless it benefited you. The air in the room thickened until it felt hard to breathe. Before anyone could speak again, Lily's small voice drifted down the hallway. Mom. She peeked around the corner holding her stuffed rabbit. Her eyes widened when she saw my parents. Hi, Grandma, she said timidly. My mother froze, the kind of stillness that comes before either a breakthrough or a collapse. She opened her mouth, then closed it. When she finally managed a smile, it was shaky, but real. Hello, sweetheart. Lily stepped forward cautiously, instinctively leaning into my leg. Are you mad at us? The question sliced through the room like a knife. My father blinked rapidly. My mother's hand flew to her chest. No, she whispered. No, darling. Never. My heart squeezed painfully. The cracks were widening in places I had never believed they could. Mason peeked out behind his sister, gripping her wrist. Mom said no one yells here. My father's shoulders slumped. For the first time in my life, he looked old, defeated, human. Claire, he said slowly, I never meant to make your children feel unsafe. But you did. I said. Silence settled again, thick, heavy, honest. Then my father sighed, the sound ragged and low. We don't know what to do, he admitted. Everything is out of our hands now. For a moment, none of them looked like enemies. They looked like people who had finally run out of ways to hide from consequences. I took a breath. You need to speak to legal counsel, not to me. I won't sign anything. I won't call anyone for you. But if you need help understanding what comes next, I can explain. That's all. My father swallowed hard but nodded. My mother stared at the floor. We might lose the house. You might, I said gently. Her voice trembled. Where will we go? Before I could answer, Charlotte stepped forward. You can stay with me. If I keep the condo. My father looked at her with something like surprise. Charlotte? It's my turn to help, she said. You helped me whether it was good for me or not. A fragile, strange quiet settled over us. For the first time in decades, the Monroes were talking like a family, not a hierarchy. I pulled out 2 chairs. Sit down. Let's go through what happens next. To my shock, they did. For the next hour, I explained the audit process, the legal freeze, the investigation, the timeline they should expect. My father asked questions he never would have asked me before. My mother listened with trembling hands. Charlotte chimed in when she could. And when the door finally closed behind them, the apartment felt different. Lighter. Quieter. Soft footsteps approached. Charlotte lingered near the doorway, her coat in her hands. You handled that better than I ever could have, she said quietly. I did what needed to be done. She nodded. Claire, do you think this is the end for them? I thought about everything I'd witnessed in the last hour, the cracks, the guilt, the humbling I never expected to see. No, I said. I think this is the beginning. Charlotte smiled a small, tired smile and whispered, I hope so. Then she left, and the night fell into a fragile, hopeful silence. For the first time in years, I felt something I didn't recognize at first. Power. But not the kind I'd spent my life fearing. The kind you feel when you stop allowing someone else to define your worth. 2 mornings later, I woke to the sound of a neighbor's voice carrying through the thin hallway walls. It was sharp, urgent, almost frightened. Then came another voice, lower, serious. I pulled the curtains aside and saw two people standing on the sidewalk with newspapers in hand pointing at something on the front page. A cold feeling crept down my spine. I slipped my coat on, cracked open my apartment door, and walked down the hallway toward the lobby window. One glance outside made my breath catch. My parents' faces were on the cover of the local paper, large centered color photographs. The headline screamed, "Monroe Coastal Properties under federal investigation, financial misconduct and trust. Fraud alleged." There was a smaller photo beside it, Charlotte leaving the courthouse, her face partially turned, her pearl earrings catching the flash of the cameras. The caption read, "Daughter of company CEO named in foreclosure filing." I covered my mouth as the weight of it hit me. The private storm had become public, and not just a whisper, an explosion. When I stepped outside, a neighbor across the street paused mid-step. She clutched the same newspaper and stared at me for a split second, before looking away, whispering something to the man beside her. He shot me a pitying glance. I turned, quickly got into my car, and drove straight to the grocery store. But even there, the air shifted when I entered. The cashier paused halfway through bagging someone else's groceries. A woman by the oranges nudged her friend. Another customer stared openly as I passed. It was happening. The fallout I had triggered by protecting myself was now the town's breakfast conversation. I kept my chin lifted. I pretended it didn't bother me. But inside I felt a mix of guilt, fear, and something I refused to name vindication. On my way out, my hands full of brown paper bags, I froze again. Because Charlotte was sitting on my front steps. Her coat was wrinkled. Her eyes looked swollen. Her mascara streaked faintly along her cheeks like she had wiped it in the car. She didn't move until I set the bags down beside her. "Claire," she whispered, "I don't know where else to go." My chest squeezed. "What happened?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Everything." She pulled a folded newspaper from her bag and held it up with a shaking hand. "My sons. Their school saw the article," she said. "Bradley's lawyer called this morning. He says the boys shouldn't be around me until all this settles. I'm not even allowed to pick them up today." Her voice broke entirely. She covered her face with her hands. "I'm losing them, Claire. I'm losing everything." I sat beside her, letting the winter air bite at my cheeks. "I'm sorry," I murmured. Charlotte shook her head. "No, I deserve some of this. But they don't." She leaned back against the step and stared at the sky, her breath coming in sharp, trembling pulls. "The condo is under the company name. They can seize it any day now. Do you have anywhere else to go?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "I thought Mom and Dad would take me in, but they told me they're not sure where they'll be living next week." My heart twisted. "Come inside," I said. "We'll figure it out." She blinked at me, stunned. "You're still willing to help me? After everything?" I nodded slowly. "You're my sister, and your kids need you." I got the groceries inside, settled the kids with a movie, and made tea for Charlotte. She sat at the kitchen table like she didn't know what to do with her hands. "My parents... Have they called you?" she asked. "Yes." I sat across from her. "They're in panic mode." Charlotte stared at the steam rising from her mug. "They told me you caused all this." I met her eyes. "I protected myself. You know the truth now." She nodded. "I do." Her voice softened. "Last night they wanted me to convince you to sign something, to undo everything. They said if you didn't, you'd destroy the entire family." "And what did you say?" I whispered. Her eyes welled again. "I told them they already destroyed it." I exhaled shakily. She wiped her tears. "What happens now?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Hello." Her voice was calm, steady, controlled, exactly what I needed. "Claire, the Federal Review has expanded. They're subpoenaing documents from the company, and Your parents may be required to give statements. My heart hammered. Statements. As in, yes, she replied. Under oath. I pressed a hand to the wall. And the house. Unless something changes, foreclosure proceedings will be filed within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. A lifetime for them. A small miracle for me. And Claire, she added, voice softening, I want to be clear, none of this is your fault, legally or morally. I closed my eyes, breathing out slowly. Thank you. When I returned to the kitchen, Charlotte waited, her face searching mine. Well, she whispered. I sat down across from her. It's moving fast, faster than anyone expected. Fear flashed across her face. Then something else resolve. Then I need to be different, she whispered. I need to start now. It was the first truly honest thing she'd said in years. Okay, I said, one step at a time. The kids wandered in moments later, tugging at Charlotte's sleeve, showing her their coloring pages. She smiled weakly, trying to match their energy. Mason held up a page full of scribbled dinosaurs. This one's for you, he said shyly. Charlotte pressed a hand to her heart, her voice breaking. Thank you, buddy. Watching them together, something shifted in me. The past was messy, painful, raw. But what stood in front of me, the possibility of a different future, felt real for the first time. And as Charlotte knelt on the living room floor helping Lily tape their drawings to the wall, I realized something important. The collapse wasn't the end. It was the clearing, the space for something better to grow, and I wasn't afraid of what came next. The following week unfolded in slow, heavy waves. Every day brought something new. Another headline, another frantic voicemail, another reminder that the family I had once tiptoed around was unraveling in plain sight. Yet the unraveling somehow made space for moments I never expected. By midweek, I sat across from Patricia in a small cafe near the harbor, its windows fogged from the cold and the scent of cinnamon drifting through the air. She wore a navy wool coat, her silver hair perfectly pinned back. She looked calm, composed, like someone who had seen storms much darker than mine. You look exhausted, she said gently. I admitted. But I feel more awake than I have in years. She nodded approvingly. That's usually how it works. Truth wakes you up. We ordered tea, and I told her everything that had happened, the press, the visits, Charlotte's breakdown, the kids' questions. I didn't sugarcoat any of it. I didn't need to. Patricia listened with a quiet focus that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Claire, she said finally, your parents didn't treat you poorly because you were weak. They treated you poorly because you were strong enough to absorb it, strong enough not to explode, strong enough to be convenient. I stared at my hands. Sometimes I think I should have spoken up sooner. You did, she said firmly. Last week, that was the moment you chose yourself. I blinked fast. I wasn't expecting to feel so calm afterwards. Calm, she said. Stirring her tea is what happens when you stop betraying yourself. Those words found a place inside me and settled there. There was a pause before I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Should I ask you to stop the foreclosure? Patricia raised her eyes, studying me carefully. Is that what you want? My throat tightened. I don't know. She leaned back in her chair. Think carefully. Are you asking because you feel responsible for them? Or because it feels wrong to let consequences happen? I hated how easily she saw through me. A little of both. Patricia smiled softly. You're a good person, Claire. But being good doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for people who would never do the same. I swallowed. I don't want to be cruel. You aren't, she said. Letting consequences happen is not cruelty. It's reality. I took a slow breath. I'll think about it. Good. She tapped my hand lightly. Just remember, peace doesn't come from rescuing people. It comes from choosing who you allow back into your life. We walked out together, the cold air brushing my face like a reminder of how clear things had become. She gave me one last reassuring smile before heading to her car. "Call me when you're ready." I watched her leave, then drove home in thoughtful silence. By the time I stepped inside, Charlotte was sitting at the dining table helping Lily with homework while Mason colored beside them. My living room looked warmer than it had in years, full of soft light crayons scattered everywhere and a strange, unfamiliar feeling. Family. "Mom." Mason ran to me, waving his drawing. "Look, I made a snowman with dragon wings." I scooped him up and kissed his cheek. "That's incredible." Charlotte looked up, smiling cautiously. "How was your meeting?" "Good," I said. "Really good." She seemed relieved. For a while we all sat together, me folding laundry. Charlotte sounding out spelling words with Lily Mason, making the snowman breathe fire. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. A life where things felt gentle instead of strained, honest instead of tense. But the moment didn't last forever. Near sunset, a car door slammed outside. I stiffened instantly. Charlotte's eyes widened. We both knew that sound. I opened the door before they could knock. My parents stood in the hallway, my mother clutching a paper folder. My father's expression, drawn pride, stripped away. "Claire," my mother said, voice trembling. "Please. Can we talk?" I stepped aside but kept my posture firm. They entered slowly, their eyes flicking over the kids, the living room, Charlotte. My father cleared his throat. "We received a notice today. We have 60 days to vacate the house." I nodded. "I know." My mother stepped closer. "We can't fix this without you." Her voice cracked and something in me tightened, but not in the old way, not in the way that made me shrink. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like their child standing before them. I felt like a whole person, a mother, a woman who had built a life separate from their control. "I'm sorry this is happening," I said softly, "but I won't be your safety net." My father opened his mouth to argue, but Charlotte spoke first. "Mom, Dad, stop." She stood up, shoulders squared. "Claire is right. You have to face what you did." My mother looked at her with wide eyes like she didn't recognize her own daughter anymore. "We're not abandoning you," Charlotte continued. "We're just not protecting you from consequences anymore." My father faltered. For a moment I saw him swallow grief, pride, fear, something complicated, something human. He sank onto the couch. "I never thought it would come to this." My mother nodded, tears slipping silently. "We never meant to hurt you. Either of you." Charlotte wiped her eyes. "Intentions don't erase damage." My father rubbed his face. "What happens now?" I looked at him steadily. "What happens now is that you rebuild. Honestly, just like we are." My mother's gaze softened. "Will you help us? Not financially, but—" She searched for the right word. "Guidance," she whispered. My breath caught. Not control, not obligation. Guidance. A request, not a demand. "I can do that," I said gently. "But only if we set boundaries." They nodded, both of them, like they finally understood what the word meant. We talked for another hour, slow, uncomfortable, honest. The kids listened quietly from the rug. Charlotte sat beside me, our shoulders occasionally brushing like we were learning how to be sisters at last. When my parents finally stood to leave, Lily hugged my mother shyly. My mother's tears fell freely as she whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart." My father placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Not heavy, not commanding, gentle. As they left the apartment, I watched them walk down the hall, smaller, humbled, but not defeated. and for the first time, I believed something new. This wasn't the destruction of our family. It was the transformation, the painful breaking, the necessary beginning, the moment where all of us finally stopped performing and started becoming real. 2 months later, the world outside had thawed into early spring. The sidewalks were still damp with the last traces of winter, but the air carried that first hint of warmth, the kind that reminded you life could grow again after being frozen solid. I stood in the backyard of the house. Patricia helped me secure a modest but sunlit place, with a patch of grass big enough for the kids to run wild. Lily and Mason chased each other through the yard, their laughter drifting through the cool breeze light and unburdened. Behind me, the sliding door opened. Charlotte stepped out, balancing 2 glasses of iced tea. She looked different. Simpler clothes, hair pulled back, no designer labels in sight. Softer, real. "They are tireless," she said, handing me a glass as Lily and Mason collapsed into a heap near the garden bed. "They finally have room to play," I said. "Room to breathe." Charlotte nodded, her expression tinged with something tender. I didn't know what peace looked like until I saw this. We sat on the patio chairs watching the kids build towers of sticks and rocks. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, like we had finally learned how to exist together without competition, without insecurity, without the old scripts our parents had written for us. "Mom and Dad called this morning," Charlotte said. "The condo sold. They're moving into that small rental across town." I sipped my tea. "How did they sound?" "Humbling," she said with a faint smile. "Sad. But lighter. Like they finally stopped pretending to be invincible." I looked out at the yard again. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what matters. Charlotte studied me carefully. "They want to come for dinner. All of us. Like a reset." My heart tightened at the thought. The memories of Christmas Eve still lived inside me, sharp edges I hadn't completely sanded down. But there was also the memory of the night they sat in my living room, stripped of all their armor, asking for guidance instead of obedience. "Do you think we're ready?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "We're a lot closer than we've ever been." I smiled softly. "Maybe it's time." Charlotte leaned back, exhaling. "I never imagined we'd end up here actually trying. It feels strange." "It feels like healing," I said. "Slow, messy, but real." I thought back to the night it all began, the cold December air, the humiliation at that dining table, the feeling of being trapped under years of silence. I'd walked out with nothing but my children's hands in mine and the smallest spark of courage in my chest. And somehow that spark had grown into a fire that reshaped everything. Lily and Mason ran over, breathless and smiling. "Mom, Aunt Charlotte. Can we plant flowers here?" Charlotte looked at me, eyes brightening. "We can do that. I'd love to." The kids cheered and ran inside to grab supplies, their voices echoing with joy. Charlotte watched them disappear and whispered, "They're so lucky to have you." I felt a lump rise in my throat. I'm lucky to have them. A car pulled up in the driveway just then. I turned and felt my breath catch. My parents stepped out slowly, holding a store-bought pie and a small bag of groceries. No designer coats, no air of superiority, no entitlement. Just 2 older people carrying offerings like they hoped to be invited in. My father raised his hand in a hesitant wave. My mother's eyes were already glistening. I walked toward them, heart pounding with something that wasn't fear anymore. "Hi," I said softly. "Hi," my mother whispered. "We brought dessert, and we'd like to help cook if that's okay." I glanced at the kids who were now peeking from the window with wide eyes, then back at my parents. "Come in," I said. "Let's start over." Inside the house, filled with footsteps, gentle laughter, the sound of dishes being unpacked. For the first time in my life, there was no hierarchy in the room, no one directing, no one belittling. Everyone simply contributed. My father chopped vegetables beside Mason. My mother helped Lily arrange a vase of flowers. Charlotte set the table, something she'd never done before. When we finally sat down to eat, the table wasn't extravagant, just a simple meal. But it felt like more than enough. Halfway through dinner, my father cleared his throat. "Claire," he said, "I don't know how to say this right, but I'm proud of you." The words hit me like a slow, warm wave, not because I needed them, but because I finally didn't. "Thank you," I said quietly. "And I'm sorry," my mother added, her voice trembling. "Not just for the past few months, for the years before that." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know. And I want to be better," she whispered. "For you. For the kids. For all of us." "I believe you," I said. It wasn't forgiveness in a grand, dramatic sense. It was something quieter. A choice to move forward, not as the family we had pretended to be, but as the one we were trying finally to become. Later that night, after everyone left and the kids were tucked into bed, I stepped onto the back porch alone. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and for the first time in my life, I felt undeniably, completely free. I had walked away from being treated like a servant. I had walked into my voice, and that one choice changed everything. If you're still listening, thank you for being here with me through this journey. If you've ever had to find your voice after years of silence, I would love to hear your story too. Share it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story moved, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories just like this. You're not alone, and you deserve better too.